Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Our next guest is a hero. It's a big word, and it's a word I don't use very often. In fact, I very rarely use it. He really is a hero. He spent 2 years in prison, as you will know by now, from February 2013 to February last year, for basically blowing the whistle on torture and on CIA torture, CIA rendition, and the waterboarding techniques used to interrogate Al-Qaeda prisoners. That takes some guts, knowing what the inevitable outcome of it is when you do blow the whistle and you do, expose these things. You know you're going to be targeted, as he was. He's known also as a writer for Huffington Post. He writes for them. He's been a terrorism analyst for ABC News, as well as much more besides. His resume would keep us here all night long. So let's just welcome him to the programme. He's in Pennsylvania. Terrific to welcome for the first time to this show, John Kiriakou. John, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you so much. I'm very well, thanks. Thank you very much for having me.
And I meant it when I said hero, John, because it's not easy to do what you did. People say all the time, I wish more people came out from law enforcement, from the military, to expose these things. John, the fact of the matter is, people know when you do that, you're going to be in trouble.
Sometimes I wake up and I think I was just an idiot, but...
I don't think you were an idiot. But I suppose when you were in prison for 2 years, you must have had your moments, John.
I did. When you first arrive in prison, you're in shock and you just can't believe that this has happened. Just a few years earlier, I was, briefing the president and meeting with kings and prime ministers. And then here I find myself, sitting at the Aryan table for dinner. Imagine
that, John. The Aryan table. I mean, it throws so many pictures into my mind straight away of all those TV shows. Prison break and stuff like that. But there must have been dark times. I mean, as you quite rightly said, you've been a top CIA analyst and case officer. You briefed the president. You briefed top officials, the Joint Chiefs. You were right in amongst these people. Next thing, you find yourself in prison for doing the right thing, which is that your government and your organisation was breaking the law.
They were breaking the law. And what was really clear to me was that this was obviously an illegal act. We have had something in the United States called the Federal Torture Act since 1947, and it specifically defines torture and specifically outlaws it. Besides the Federal Torture Act, we are not just the signatories, or not just, I should say, signatories to the UN Convention Against Torture. We were the authors of the UN Convention Against Torture. And so I just couldn't understand how anybody could possibly believe that this torture program that we had conceived of was somehow legal.
Tell me when you first, look, first of all, let's be honest. A lot of our listeners will know this, but we don't assume knowledge. And our program is a crossover program, John, between what you'd call mainstream commercial radio and more alternative independent radio. So there are people listening to this. They will know you, of course. They will know your name and who you are, but not the details. So when did you come to understand that people were being tortured by US military personnel?
Well, I had been the chief of the CIA's counterterrorism operations in Pakistan after September 11th. And in that position, I led a series of raids in late March 2002 that resulted in the capture of Abu Zubaydah, whom we believed at the time was the number 3 in Al-Qaeda. And so when I finished that tour in the early summer of 2002 and I went back to CIA headquarters, I happened to be in the cafeteria one day. And a senior officer from the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, called CTC, approached me in the cafeteria and said, "Oh, I'm glad I ran into you. I wanted to ask you if you were interested in being certified in the use of enhanced interrogation techniques."
Wow.
I had never heard of this term before. And I said, "Well, what's that supposed to mean?" So very excitedly, he said, "We're going to start getting rough with these guys." And I said, "Well, what does rough mean?" So he outlined to me these 10 different torture techniques that the CIA was intending to implement. In fact, they did implement them about 3 months later. And I said, "Oh, that sounds like a torture program. I don't think I want to be involved. But you know what?" I said, "Let me think about it for an hour." And I went up to the CIA's executive floor, the 7th floor, And I went to see a very senior CIA officer for whom I had worked in the Middle East about a decade earlier. And I told him about the conversation I had had in the cafeteria. And I said, what do you think about this? And he said, first, let's call it what it is. It's torture. They can use whatever euphemism they want, but it's still torture. And torture's a slippery slope. And you know how your coworkers are. You know somebody's going to go overboard and they're going to kill a prisoner. And when that happens, there's going to be a congressional investigation, and then there's going to be a criminal investigation, and somebody's going to go to prison. Do you want to go to prison? And I said, no, I don't want to go to prison. As it turned out, I was the only one who went to prison.
The only one who went to prison, yeah.
But I said, no, I don't want to go to prison. And I went back downstairs to the Counterterrorism Center, and I said, this is a torture program, and I don't want to have anything to do with it. And that was in the middle of May 2002. And then we know now from the CIA's torture report that the agency began torturing Abu Zubaydah on August 1st of that year.
And he was waterboarded a lot of times, John, wasn't he?
He was waterboarded 83 times, which, I tell college groups to whom I speak on a regular basis, I tell them all the same story. In 1968, in January, the Washington Post ran a front-page photograph of an American soldier waterboarding a North Vietnamese prisoner. And the day that photograph appeared, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, ordered an investigation. The soldier was arrested, he was charged with torture, and he was convicted and imprisoned. Well, the law didn't change since 1968. So why was waterboarding torture and illegal in 1968, but not in 2002 or in 2015? Why did it take yet another law, the McCain-Feinstein Amendment, to formally, officially, finally ban torture? Torture has always been illegal.
I imagine, I've spoken to ex-servicemen on this program before, ex-military servicemen from the US and from Britain. Now, typically, the ones who come on, they're very disillusioned. The soldiers, they talk about, realising when they were in Iraq that they weren't really there for the reasons they were told they were going to be there. And the horrors of realising that they were basically an occupying force in a country where they were, going through villages of, extremely poor people and all these horror stories. You get into the CIA, John, obviously because you're bright, there's no doubt about that. And you want to be... you want to do right by your country, and you want to protect your country from foreign enemies, domestic enemies as well. And here you are learning that this country that you thought was so virtuous and stood for the right thing and was so good was capable of doing this. And I suppose around about this time as well, we learn about, it was a couple of years later, we learned about Abu Ghraib and all the things that went on there and Basra and all that. What does that do, John? What does that do to a guy like you? A guy who's well-intentioned in terms of why you got into the agency?
Yeah, I have to agree with you and with your guests. I became terribly disillusioned. My family emigrated to the United States from Greece in 1931. All four of my grandparents left the island of Rhodes in 1931 and landed on Ellis Island. And to hear my paternal grandfather tell it, Franklin Roosevelt was personally waiting for him in New York Harbor to offer him a job and freedom and citizenship in the American dream. And so my grandparents and parents always instilled in us a sense that we needed to repay the country for the kindness that it showed us in allowing us to emigrate. And so public service was always very important in my family. So I went into the CIA thinking that not only am I going to serve my country, I'm going to get to see the world too. And I had a facility for foreign languages. I thought, well, this is great. They'll pay for a PhD program. I can use my foreign languages. I'll see the world. I'll meet important people. This is really going to be a great career. And in the beginning, it was. And it was because two presidents, George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, actually had respect for international human rights. The CIA famously went through what they called a cull, where they fired about a third of their recruited sources because those sources had some sort of human rights problem in their background. And I remember by the mid-1990s saying, well, this is great. This is what an honorable intelligence service should be like. We should be collecting intelligence and recruiting spies to steal secrets, but at the same time, we need to be respecting human rights. And that was something really to be proud of. But boy, everything changed on September 11th. And I remember the first inkling that things were really going wrong was when I was in Pakistan. And we had, it was the night that we had captured Abu Zubaydah, but we had caught many dozens of other al-Qaeda fighters. And
can I just interject there? Weren't a lot of these fighters that were being picked up, weren't they being handed over by people for bounties? And a lot of them ended up in Guantanamo Bay and elsewhere, and they really weren't guilty of anything.
Oh, I would say probably 80% of them were just completely innocent of any crime. And listen, here's what was happening.
Not you now, but I'm not speaking about you specifically. But how could military officers and platoon leaders and commanders, how could they be so stupid, John, when to be taking people into custody based on Faisal says this guy over here is, and damn well that Faisal has got nothing. He can't even afford to buy the crop to plant for next season's corn or whatever. So of course Faisal is going to say his grandmother's in Al-Qaeda. How did those army guys, those Marines, how did they fall for that? What was going on?
This was my first sustained exposure to the U.S. military.
Right.
I would brief, high-ranking officers every once in a while, but this is the first time that I actually had to live and work with them. And I found, frankly, that most of them were ill-equipped, ill-informed, in many cases not very bright, and they just made this decision early on that they're going to send everybody, literally everybody, to Guantanamo and sort it out later. And Guantanamo was supposed to be this temporary holding site where we were going to hold people long enough to figure out in what district in the United States they should be tried. But what was happening was, like you say, if Mohammed owes Faisal some money and Faisal doesn't want to repay the money, he just goes to the local U.S., sergeant who's in charge of that village and says, oh, this guy Mohammed is Al-Qaeda. And then Mohammed goes to Guantanamo and Faisal doesn't have to pay the loan back.
Yeah.
And we saw this all the time. Or if maybe you wanted to marry my sister and I didn't like you, I went to the Americans and said you're Al-Qaeda, and then you end up in Guantanamo for the next 14 years. So that happened a lot. But either the U.S. military was unwilling or too stupid, frankly, to do anything about it. And then when you have a president and vice president like George W. Bush and Dick Cheney setting the tone for this kind of policy, the situation was almost hopeless for anybody finding themselves in Guantanamo.
24 minutes past the hour. Terrific to have John Kiriakou on the line to us. It really is. Takes courage to do what he's done. Top CIA analyst, he briefed the top man, he briefed the president and others like him. A couple of people disagreeing with John, agreeing with him on everything except the Bill Clinton thing. We don't like Clinton, some of our listeners are saying. He certainly was no champion of human rights, and asked the Rwandans about his failure to deal with genocide there. I could have said that, but I don't want to be interrupting you every couple of minutes, John. I'm an argumentative Irishman. I like to have arguments, but I'm not going to be arguing with you over every single comment you make. I'm not going to do that. But I wouldn't be any fan, or of his wife either. Listen, I'm going to get this one out of the way. You're a very smart man. Again, I'm not patronising you. You've done your homework, so you know the sort of show this is. I've got serious problems with the official version of September the 11th. I want to get this one out of the way. What do you think?
I think there are some problems with the official version of September 11th. I'm not what you might call a 9/11 truther. I don't believe that there was a controlled explosion or that Jews did it or the Trilateral Commission. But, there are 28 redacted pages, redacted from the 9/11 Commission report that the American public simply are not allowed to see. I don't know what's in those 28 pages, but I can speculate.
Yeah.
And I believe that those 28 pages contain documentary evidence of the official involvement in the 9/11 attacks of the Saudi government. I don't trust the Saudis. I don't like the Saudis. The Saudis are not reliable allies. the Saudis are monsters when it comes to human rights.
They're horrible, aren't they, the Saudis? Let's be honest about it. Yeah.
And ironically, they chair the UN Human Rights Commission right now, which is just insane to me.
Well, David Cameron should be ridden out of town on a rail for his part in that. What the hell is going on there? Isn't it?
Just disgraceful. But John Kerry's no better. You know, I wrote a piece that ran in, it's a syndication service here in the United States called otherwords.org. It runs in 220 small town newspapers around the country. And I wrote about how the Saudis were assuming control of this UN Human Rights Committee. And I said it was absolutely disgraceful for the following reasons. And I listed 4 or 5 or 6 different reasons. And a reporter picked up the story and wrote a story about it and asked John Kerry, my former boss, for a comment. And Kerry, all Kerry would say was that he had supreme confidence in the ability of the Saudis to run the Human Rights Committee.
Imagine that.
It's like, what kind of hypocrisy is that? What kind of hypocrisy is it when an American State Department officer has to go to a host government and beat them about the face and head because of their human rights record, while in the very next room, an American CIA officer is asking that same government to house a secret prison where we're going to render somebody and torture him mercilessly for the next 18 months. It's hypocrisy, and it's unacceptable.
Absolutely right. 27 minutes past the hour. I am going to leave 9/11. I just want to mention this. I came up in commercial radio, John. I didn't study journalism in school. I laterally went to uni and studied university and studied history and English, then went on to do a postgraduate degree in television and radio. And I broadcast live on September the 11th. I took over, me and my presenter took over the afternoon schedule of WLR-FM in Ireland, very, very successful commercial radio station. We took all the afternoon jocks off the air because of what was going on at 9 a.m. in New York City. And we, of course, we did what we were told. We took the Associated Press wires, we took Reuters, and within days, we were saying that Bin Laden did it and these hijackers did it and all of that. It was a couple of years later that I began to have reservations about it. I didn't have any background in conspiracy theories. I had no interest in conspiracy theories. But reading Thomas Keane's book, 2 books I read, one written by David Icke and one written by Thomas Keane, who was the commission chairman, where he basically said, they gave us $5 million to investigate the worst terrorist atrocity in America. We spent much more money investigating whether Bill Clinton received oral sex from an intern.
Right.
He said it was set up to fail, Keane. I've come to the conclusion. I believe you're honest. I believe you're calling it as you see it. I have no idea how those towers came down. I really don't. And I get really pissed off with some of the truthers killing one another over whether it was demolitions or whether it was the planes or whatever. What I've come to believe is, and this kills me, it kills me to live in a world where I believe this. I've come to believe that agents of the US government may be working with agents of the British government, maybe working with the Saudis maybe, to further an agenda. Either brought the buildings down one way or another, or equally as badly, John, they allowed somebody else to do it. In other words, they turned a blind eye to it. And that's what I believe. Well, it doesn't really matter what I believe, because my listeners know it kills me to live in a world like that, right, that people are capable of doing that. What do you think? I
wouldn't disagree with you, especially with the last thing that you said. Frankly, I don't know what the truth is. I can tell you what Abu Zubaydah told me. He told me that he didn't want to attack the United States on 9/11, that he wanted to attack Israel. He said all he wanted to do was to kill Jews. He didn't want to attack the United States, but that he had been overruled. And he was the one who told us that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the mastermind. We knew that the mastermind was somebody named Mukhtar, but we didn't know who this Mukhtar was until Abu Zubaydah told Ali Soufan, an FBI agent who was debriefing him at the time. So that was the only indication that we had. Now, with that said, I think a strong argument for a conspiracy can be made, because what has happened in the post-9/11 era is that we have transitioned to a full-time wartime economy. And after all these years, mind you, September 11th is nearly 15 years ago, we have been on a wartime footing. Without that massive federal spending on armaments and on a very large military, much larger than we need to defend ourselves, certainly, the economy would go into depression. We just couldn't maintain this level of spending. So you know what? I'm not going to disagree with you. I think there could be something to it, and I think that probably we're never going to know the truth.
You know, I always get tweets from listeners where we go out on several platforms and our audience is very big. I don't say that to brag, but it is big. And I'll get these emails and these tweets. Oh, he won't tell the truth, and he's working for the system. And what some people don't understand is they're just not prepared to understand that, you know, there are so many different points of view on this. And we're talking to John Kiriakou, who's worked for the CIA. He worked for them for the right reasons. He got into his job, as he quite rightly explained, his family having been immigrants, second, third generation Greek-American, who wanted to invest something back into the country that had taken care of his family, looking after, taking care of the country, protecting it against enemies, foreign and domestic, and all of that. I think John's been incredibly honest to say that he's not sure, or he wouldn't rule it out, or it's not beyond the bounds of possibility, because he means that. I meet people all the time. Listen, we have families who think it's crazy that 9/11 was a self-inflicted wound. We have to get over this calling people shills and protectors just because they're not sure about it. Right. Jesus Christ, I'm delighted that he's saying he's not sure about it. That's a start for me, you know.
I have a really great friend, a former very senior CIA officer by the name of Ray McGovern.
And we love Ray. He's a regular on this program, Ray.
Oh, Ray is just a great
lovely
friend,
man,
like a brother to me. And, you know, Ray, his thinking on this issue is far closer to yours than it is to mine. Ray is convinced that it was a conspiracy, and that if Bin Laden was involved, that Bin Laden was used as a stooge.
Yeah, he does. And to be honest now, as long as I've known Ray about 2 years, which isn't long in the grand scheme of things. But when he's been commenting on Syria and Crimea, Ukraine and Russia, obviously, as you well know. And that's lovely. But I've never kind of dug. I'm very polite about it, John. I don't want to scare guys like you off. I'll tell you why. And this might sound very patronising. What I'm trying to do here, and other producers who believe some things that are considered extreme, I don't want to use, guys. I'm not trying to use you at all. I want our listeners to hear a guy like you had the courage to talk about torture. And because you saw what you saw, you're now looking at other things and you're considering the possibilities. Because ultimately all I want people to do...
Exactly right.
Exactly. It's consider things. Exactly. And I love it, you know. Can we talk about Syria? Is it fair to say, and you know your great friend and our friend Ray McGovern certainly agrees with this, is that tomorrow or Wednesday, it's tomorrow, is the media are hilarious, John. They're calling it the 5th anniversary of the uprising. Now, I'm not going to say for a minute is that Bashar al-Assad and his government didn't have opposition who wanted Syria to be more democratic. I have no doubt people like that lived there. It was an autocracy, we know that. An authoritarian country. We could say regime. I don't like saying regime. But isn't it fair to say that all the evidence now points to our intelligence agencies here in London, MI6, the CIA, the NSA and other dark actors basically handed all the money and all the weapons that they could find to so-called moderate opposition groups in Syria as far back as 2008, 2009 to unleash the absolute mayhem that we've seen there now. And I'm not for a minute saying that Assad is an angel. I'm not. But I'm saying that, again, we've been caught out again red-handed. And I say we, Britain, the United States and others, in destabilising a country that mightn't have been a glowing beacon of democracy in the region at all, but was a much better place before we decided to stick our oar in. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that. And this is really yet another example of this misguided and in many cases illegal neoconservative foreign policy that we have. And it spans administrations. It's not just George W. Bush. Barack Obama is just as complicit in this as George W. Bush was. I think you're right. I think the idea was that we would arm as many people in Syria as we possibly could because they were ostensibly opposed to Bashar al-Assad and may work with us against ISIS once ISIS was created. Of course, we're the reason ISIS was created in the first place. And then, of course, all hell broke loose. The thing is let me give you an example. when we were planning the Iraq war, there were very clearly drawn battle lines within the U.S. government. And of course, this was all behind closed doors. But the Office of the Vice President, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council were gung-ho to invade Iraq. The CIA, the State Department, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were saying, this is a mistake. We need to focus on al-Qaeda. We need to find bin Laden. We shouldn't invade Iraq. And I remember an NSC, a National Security Council senior director, saying at a secure video teleconference that as soon as we cross the border into Iraq, the Iraqi people are going to throw flowers at us. That's what he said. And you get that same neocon attitude when you talk to these people about Syria. That, well, what the Syrians need is a democracy along with a moderate, Sunni-led body politic. Well, wait a minute. There's no history of democracy anywhere in the Levant, especially a U.S.-style democracy. And who are we to impose our form of government on anybody else? In the meantime, we're arming practically all sides, which keep our munitions factories running at full blast.
Why is it really happening, John? I'm going to be talking tomorrow about the migrant crisis and the fact that we know that Angela Merkel in Germany got a right kick in the backside by the electorate over the weekend.
Right.
In the midterm, well, I suppose we could call them the midterm elections, but the local elections and the regional elections, a lot of right-wing candidates have done well because she basically opened the floodgates to the migrants. What about those, like David Icke, say, for example, and others who say that the crisis, the mass movement of people across Europe, is an intended consequence of the madness of destroying Libya and Syria. And that ultimately what that is about is it's ultimately about dividing and conquering. It's about controlling us.
I think that's exactly what it is. I think that's exactly what it is, because when we have this kind of aggressive foreign policy, we want everybody else to be weak because that's how we control them. We want a Libya in chaos, a Syria in chaos, an Afghanistan in chaos. Now, our allies are going to disagree with us behind closed doors, which is exactly why you don't see the Israelis in any way supporting what's happening in Syria. Because as far as the Israelis are concerned, the devil they know is better than the devil they don't. And they know that Bashar al-Assad is no threat to them. Well, to the United States and to the UK and to others, we like to stir the pot. We like to keep everybody off balance. Now, that tends to fail pretty spectacularly. Look what happened in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was the only bulwark against Iran. He was the only thing that kept Iran from meddling in the small Gulf states, for example, or posing a greater threat to Lebanon.
Now, when you say meddling now, using, doing basically what we do, sending arms, because because the Iranians historically, they don't really attack anybody, so they don't.
No, actually the Iranians don't. The Iranians never have attacked anybody. I mean, even in the Iran-Iraq war, as bad as Saddam Hussein was, the Iranians didn't attack. It was Saddam who attacked them.
That's right, with weapons delivered by, amongst others,
the United States.
By the United States. Yeah. So, of course, we knew all along what Saddam didn't have, because what he had, we gave it to him.
It was pretty clear to most all of us in the CIA that there were no weapons of mass destruction. And we told the White House that repeatedly, that there were no weapons of mass destruction. We knew that the nuclear program had been dismantled in the late 1980s. We knew that the biological weapons you can make in your kitchen, in your home, so there's just no way to know. Besides, they had no delivery system. But chemical weapons, which is where everybody was wrapped around the axle, there was just simply no evidence that the Iraqis had chemical weapons. They had them in earlier years, but they had destroyed them thanks to the UN weapons inspections all throughout the 1990s.
Yeah. Oh, John, I'm going to do a quick time check. I'm so glad you're on the programme. 20 minutes to the top of the hour. And I'm very self-critical, and I didn't want to sound patronising when I was explaining, why it's so important to bring Ray McGovern and you and others on Because, John, there are three types of people. There are people who believe in a very, very, very sinister conspiracy, which is ultimately about, reducing the population and doing other very terrible things. I'll be honest, I'm in that group. Then there's a group of people then who understands that most of what political leaders, elected leaders, officials and military men and women whom we see on TV are telling lies, and those people then disagree about the reasons that they're doing it. It's either about oil or it's about money. But then there is the majority of people, and the majority of people who go blissfully living their lives, watching the sports and watching the reality television shows, and don't understand that something is very, very, very wrong. And I want to bridge the gap between us and them. I know, look, we're one program, but that's kind of exactly what we what we were set up for. And
Right.
and without guys like you, we wouldn't have a chance. Without people like you who were on the other side of the fence, working for governments, but saw something was terribly wrong and had the courage to do something about it. And by the way, anybody who wants to see what other people are tweeting, it's all one word, Richie Allen Show in Twitter. Press enter, you'll see what other people are tweeting. Alex was on to say, Richie, he was a CIA analyst. He dealt with actionable intelligence, which is much less discriminating than circumstantial, says Alex. Alex is not a fan, I don't think, but that's okay. We are a democracy.
Listen, I know how unpopular I am among some circles, and that's fine. I accept it. I have a thick skin.
Yeah, fair enough. You got a youngster in the background as well, haven't you? I can hear a youngster in the background. No, it's good. It's lovely. 17 minutes to the top of the hour. John Kiriakou is our guest. It's great to have him on. Thanks for the tweets. At Richie Allen Show on Twitter. Richie at richieallen.co.uk. We've got John for another 5 or 6 minutes. So Putin said today that Russia is going to draw down the smallish force that it has in Syria. We understand it's 30 planes, and there's been a force, a battalion of sorts minding or looking after those planes, and obviously then the advisors that would be there advising the Syrian government. What's that all about? Is that to show that Russia really wants to, push forward with the peace process, or is it more gamesmanship? Is Putin saying, because at the moment Interpol are saying, well, there are thousands of Al-Qaeda in Europe already. They're just waiting for the opportunity to kill us all. Is Putin just saying, well, hang on a second, we've been seriously upsetting these guys over the last few months. We've killed thousands of them. There's not many left. So that's kind of one-upmanship or gamesmanship. Or is Putin, do you think, really determined to get behind the peace process, John?
I honestly believe, and maybe this sounds naive, but I think we ought to take Putin at face value here. I think that he saw Russian involvement in Syria as a limited prospect in the very beginning. I think the Russians had a far better defined mission and goal in Syria, certainly than the United States has, where we just send people and forget to bring them home. But I think that he's got a plan. This is part of the plan. And he's ready to at least in part go home. So I think that what we see here is what we get. We ought to take him at his word.
He's got problems with Ukraine, of course, and that's another. You look at Victoria Nuland, the wife of Bob Kagan, and you look at what they've done in Ukraine there.
Oh, yes.
I mean, it's shocking, isn't it? I mean, they took out Yanukovych. We have Poroshenko there. I would use I shouldn't probably. I should be more professional, but I would use a word like puppet. We have Natalie Jaresko there, a Chicago-born woman. Yes, she is of Ukrainian descent, but she's running she's managing the purse strings now for Ukraine. It's a coup by any other name. So Russia is surrounded, or it could be argued it's surrounded, with what's happening in Turkey. Turkey is very unstable at the moment, John. He's got to be. Russia's got to be worried, hasn't it? And this brings us then to the idea that there are those pushing us towards a global conflict that involves Russia, possibly China, against Britain, the United States, Israel, the Saudis, and others. Now, I want to believe that it won't happen. That's what I want to believe. But I can't help but believe that there are those driving us towards it. What do you think?
Yeah. Again, I'm going to have to agree with you. One of the things that successive American governments and certainly American people fail to understand is that Putin and really most Russians, I think, feel encircled by the United States and its allies. They see every time NATO adds a new member country, they see that as a threat to their security, as well they should. And so I think that we just fail to understand their concerns. And so when they do something that's clearly in their own military interests, we see that as a provocation and we see that as a threat. I don't think it's a threat. I think it's survival. I don't see a global conflict, not because of anything that the United States does, certainly, but I think the Chinese are so cautious and so averse really to the use of force. And I worked with the Chinese in the United Nations for many years. They really don't like the use of force. I just don't see a conflagration, put it that way.
I hope you're right. Do you agree with me, though? We're back to the neocons again. That there are those who would push us, if not to the brink of it, but given the chance, for example, given the opportunity, there are those who would unleash that.
Yeah, I think Victoria Nuland is a dangerous force in the region, and certainly Robert Kagan is even more dangerous. There are organizations, think tanks, and places in Washington that won't even allow them to darken the hallways. And how in the world they're commanding leadership positions in American foreign policy is just something that we should all be ashamed of.
They've not gone away, John. So they haven't. These people. They've just not gone away. The likes of Bolton and Wolfowitz, and we mentioned Kagan, the authors of the Project for a New American Century. These people who believe that to maintain America's hegemony, it's got to be involved in multiple theatre wars. I mean, when you think about it, and was it Wesley Clark who eavesdropped and heard things he shouldn't have heard about the plans for countries like Syria and Libya and stuff like that? Psychopaths they might be, but their plans have kind of come to fruition, haven't they?
Well, they have, and it's been very incremental. And when it's incremental like that, it's easy to miss. And I think that's exactly what has happened. I mean, it seems to me like the neoconservatives have had their eyes on Ukraine for years, many years, maybe decades. And they finally got the kind of, as you, I think, appropriately put it, a puppet regime in power right now.
Do you know what? Listening to you, I know you will have friends, some who might still be in service and some who aren't.
Yes.
What do they make of you, John? I think, and I don't mean in terms of you going to prison for doing the right thing. I think most of them would grudgingly admire you for doing the right thing. Torture is wrong. And it's a marvellous thing you did. I'll never forget that. As long as I'm a journalist and doing programmes like this, the easy thing to do is to turn a blind eye to it. You had the courage not to. That makes you a great guy, in my opinion.
Thank you.
No, it really does, John. It can't be said enough times. So you look at people who served with you, people who are still there. What do you think they make of you talking now in terms like you have been about Ukraine and stuff like that? What would they make of what your opinion?
I actually still have a lot of friends at the CIA, still active duty CIA. In fact, 51 of them have signed a letter to the president asking him to pardon me. So I do hear from them, and they say that I have overreacted because of what has happened to me over the last 4 years, and that I find fault in too much as it relates to American policy. But I tell them, and listen, I'm a lifelong liberal Democrat. We use the word progressive now, but a lifelong Democrat. And they hate it when I tell them, look, Ronald Reagan was right. Government is the problem. It's not the solution to the problem. And when we have a government that wants to have its hands in everything, whether it's an expansionist military policy or expansionist foreign policy or taking away our civil liberties and carrying out warrantless wiretaps or cracking into our iPhones, that is a problem. And I really believe government has become the problem, not the solution.
John, we had a story today just before we go. It might sound like something small, but it's big, in Liverpool. Obviously a great city, a great historical city.
Great city.
marvellous city. He gave us the Beatles and a couple of terrible soccer teams. We won't get into that. I'm in Manchester, so I'm biased. But a couple of women today were fined and given community service in a court in Liverpool because they refused to obey a zoning order which made it illegal to give food to homeless people. Now, John, we're in serious trouble here.
You see, we have the same new kinds of laws. It's now illegal in Seattle to provide food to homeless people, and so I hope, and this is a very new law. I hope that people, walk into McDonald's or Wendy's or Kentucky Fried Chicken and buy food just for the homeless, so that they can flout this law and challenge it on the streets.
Civil disobedience, John. Howard Zinn was right. We keep bringing him up. You cannot obey tyrannical laws like that. You didn't obey a tyrannical law. It's absolutely outrageous that you wouldn't be pardoned. And I'm sickened that some former and current CIA people said that you overreacted. How could you overreact to being sentenced to 2 years in jail for doing the right thing and telling people that your government is committing heinous crimes? I think you're absolutely brilliant, John. And listen, I'd love to have you back on again in the future to talk about, not so much about your own story, but when you've got things to say. I know you write for Aura as well, and I probably should have mentioned that. Aura.tv, you'll find John on there. But anything that's happening geopolitically that you're very interested in, you can always come back on here and have a chat with us. I really enjoyed having you on.
Thank you so much. The pleasure's all mine. Thanks for inviting me.
Look after yourself, John. Thanks. Bye for now. John Kiriakou on the line to us there from his home in Pennsylvania.